And unrest continues to grow in Iran as anti-government protests enter a third week there. Iran's supreme leader has signaled an upcoming crackdown on demonstrators and has called protesters vandals trying to please the U.S. president. The country is currently under a near total internet blackout. Human rights groups say dozens of people have been killed since the protests began. Donald Trump has warned Iran that if it kills protesters, the U.S. would, quote, hit the country very hard. For more on Iran's protests, we're joined now by Kamran Bokhari. He is a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
So these protests, December 28th, I believe, is when they began. And really things started, as I understand it, because of the collapse of the country's currency. It does seem to me that, 3 weeks in, this has become a much bigger, broader issue, perhaps many issues. What's your reaction to what's been happening, and what are your thoughts as to what's driving it?
I think these protests are different than what we've seen in years past, primarily because these are driven by economic hardship. And as you mentioned, the plunging of the national currency, the rial. And so this is a situation where you no longer see sort of just the youth protesting. You have the merchant community organizing some of these protests. And initially, before the crackdown began, the government was trying to distinguish between those who are engaging in rioting versus those who they think are engaged in legitimate protests. Now, that's really hard to do. And I think they gave up on that, which is why they cracked down so severely with the internet blackout and the reports coming in of use of force.
What role has the U.S. president played in this? And I ask that because what I've been reading is that perhaps, the threats that the U.S. would somehow intervene is maybe bolstering protests on the street, but also perhaps government in Iran are trying to appease President Trump. What's your read on that?
So we have to take this in the context of ongoing negotiations between the Iranian regime and the Trump White House. These have been going on for quite some time. They even were taking place even during the war with Israel, during which the United States conducted precision strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. So that's the context in which these are happening. The United States is trying to basically send a message to the regime that, we don't want to engage in any intervention, in any military intervention, but, don't force us. And so it's signaling that if you do this, then there are going to be consequences. We're going to be forced into doing things that we necessarily don't want to do. That's the message from the Trump White House. But that whole process of negotiation has been disrupted by this unrest.
I mean, given what we have seen the U.S. president do, and thinking, of course, Venezuela, and that's entered as part of the conversation that the U.S. actually might make good on those kinds of threats. It's hard to predict, of course, and I'm not asking you to necessarily predict Donald Trump's next move. But do you see a world in which the U.S. does intervene?
Look, it's always possible. I don't think that this administration is eager to intervene. I think it's being very cautious. I think that the messaging going out is more of trying to deter the other side from engaging in violence. But this is a complicated problem. The regime, from its point of view, can't let the protests continue. But if they crack down, they risk incurring potential U.S. intervention and adding fuel to the fire at home. So it's a really complicated situation. I think the imperatives and the constraints on both sides are basically forcing the government in Iran, as well as the United States government, into a position where they don't want to necessarily go. I mean, what we call geopolitical realities are overtaking whatever their subjective preferences might be.
I believe it's about 4:30 in the morning in Iran right now, and we've had this media blackout, so it's been very difficult to get verified information or video out of the country over really almost 2 days now. Do you have any intel on what is happening, or what are your concerns given the blackout as to what might be happening?
So my concerns are that the blackout is a cover for the use of some extreme force that results in significant number of deaths of protesters. So that is my concern. The problem again is, to what scale is that happening is really, really opaque. This is it's the blackout or the fog of war that is preventing us from really knowing what's happening. But we have to assume worst case, where a lot of people are getting hurt and unfortunately killed. I think that from what I'm hearing is that there is use of force. Gunfire has been heard by my contacts. And so this is not looking good. What is happening under the cover of internet blackout, is subject to anybody's speculation. And like I said, we have to assume worst case scenario.
Kamran Bokhari is a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington. Thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.